Today, we will be looking at two different articles centering around oppression. First up is a reading from Marilyn Frye, aptly titled Oppression. Frye begins the article talking about the word oppression itself. She states that the word oppression is a strong word. It repels and attracts. It is dangerous and dangerously fashionable and endangered. It is much misused and sometimes not innocently. She goes on and says that the word oppression is being stretched to meaninglessness. It is treated as though its scope includes any and all human experience of limitation or suffering, no matter the cause, degree, or consequence. She believes that the word oppression is simply overused and that we generalize oppression as just inconvenience. She doesn't like this and says human beings can be miserable without being oppressed, and it is perfectly consistent to deny that a person or group is oppressed without denying that they have feelings or that they suffer. She boils it down to, we need this word, this concept, and we need it to be sharp and sure. Later in the reading, she explains oppression and says, the experience of oppressed people is that the living of one's life is confined and shaped by forces and barriers which are not accidental or occasional and hence avoidable, but are systematically related to each other in such a way as to catch one between and among them and restrict or penalize motion in any direction. It is the experience of being caged in. All avenues in every direction are blocked or trapped. She then compares oppression to a bird cage. She says if we focus on one wire of the cage, the other wires disappear from our vision. We see a bird blocked by one wire and wonder, why doesn't the bird just fly around the wire? It's not until we step back and look at all the wires working together to keep that bird contained that we can understand why the bird is trapped. The same goes for oppression. We need to step back and look at the entire system of oppression to realize how it affects people and the world around us. Frye closes out the reading by saying, at the cageness of the birdcage is a macroscopic phenomenon. The oppressiveness of the situations in which women live our various and different lives is a macroscopic phenomenon. Neither can be seen from a microscopic perspective, but when you look macroscopically, you can see it, a network of forces and barriers which are systematically related and which conspire to the immobilization, reduction, and molding of women in the lives we live. Now let's take a look at our second article, What It Has to Do with Us, written by Alan Johnson. Johnson begins the article by talking about how white people don't normally allow people of color to talk about race without interrupting or defending themselves. He goes on to talk about individualism and its effect on oppression. He says that individualism in relation to this topic distorts our view of reality. He states, if we use individualism to explain sexism, for example, it's hard to avoid the idea that sexism exists simply because men are sexist, that sexist feelings, beliefs, needs, and motivations are aspects of who men are and make them behave in sexist ways. If sexism produces bad consequences, it's because men are bad, consciously hostile and malevolent towards women. Obviously that isn't always true, but it shows how, if we look at this in an individualistic way, we will not get perfect outcomes. He says, breaking the paralysis begins with realizing that the social world consists of far more than individuals. On the next page, he gives us a diagram of the dynamic between people and systems of privilege. He explains the diagram by saying, the diagram has two parts. The arrow on the right represents the idea that as we participate in systems, we are shaped as individual people in two ways. Through the process of socialization, we learn to participate in social life, from families, schools, religion, and the mass media, through the examples set by parents, peers, coaches, teachers, and public figures. We are exposed to the ideas and images of the world and who we are in relation to them and other people. We learn to name things and people, to value one thing or kind of person over another, to distinguish what's considered normal and acceptable from what is not. We also develop a sense of personal identity, including gender, sex, race, ethnicity, class, religion, disability status, and sexual orientation. and how that positions us in relation to other people and social systems, especially in terms of inequalities of power. He talks about how he himself witnessed inequality on TV, and he talks about the show Everyone Loves Raymond. He says, in a typical episode of the television sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond, for example, Ray Barone routinely behaves towards his wife Deborah in ways that are insensitive, sexist, adolescent, and downright stupid.
Can't you just this once think like a man?
I am. I'm completely disregarding your feelings.
But by the end of each half hour, we see yet again that she puts up with it, year after year, because for reasons that are never made clear, she just loves the guy. This sends the message that it is reasonable for a heterosexual man to expect to have an intelligent and beautiful woman who will love him and stay with him regardless of how he behaves. A few lines later, he mentions that we are shaped by a system's paths of least resistance, which prevents us with the easiest course to follow at any given situation. He says we often choose a path of least resistance because it's the only one we see. The reading talks about that concept for a while, and then moves on to talk about what it means to be involved in privilege and oppression. Johnson says, if we use the relationship between individuals and systems as a model for understanding ourselves and the world, it's easier to bring problems into the open where we can see both of them in relation to us and ourselves in relation to them. And what about people who claim to not participate in oppression? Well, Johnson says, patterns of oppression and privilege are rooted in systems that we all participate in and make happen every day, consciously or not. This means that even though we are not actively discriminatory, chances are that we still participate in discriminatory behavior because that's how society is set up. Johnson brings up how we buy products from companies that exploit their workers, and that directly is participating in a discriminatory system. To end, I will read the last part of Johnson's article because I believe it sums it up pretty nicely. To perpetuate privilege and oppression, we don't have to consciously support it. Even by our silence, we provide something essential for its future, for no system of privilege can continue to exist without most people's consent. If most men spoke out against other men's violence, for example, or if most whites stood openly against racism, it would be a critical first step toward revolutionary change. But the vast majority of us are silent, and the path of least resistance is to read that silence as consent and even support. As long as we participate in social systems, we do not get to choose whether to be involved in the consequences that result. We are involved because we are here. As such, we can only choose how to be involved, whether to simply be a part of the problem or to also to be a part of the solution. That is where our power lies and our responsibility.